To the irrepressible Mr. Tadcaster, who introduced the next act. You're not allowed to leave whilst I have you shot.
Glen Vaudrey is a repulsive birth anomaly. He runs a Victorian sideshow-style cavalcade of freaks that includes the colourblind boy, the pattern baldness man, and the girl who has a slight rash. He is here today to speak about his brothel for flies.
Hello, right.
Sure.
Oh, your phone works. Right, I'll be talking about the mystery creatures of Staffordshire. It's based on a book that me and Nick Redfern have wrote, and basically I'll be encouraging you all to buy it later. So just to start off with, I'm just starting with a map of Staffordshire, really to give you an idea of what it looks like. I originally wasn't really going to be writing a book on Staffordshire, I was writing a book on Cheshire. Cheshire actually borders with Staffordshire, and it turned out that some of the creatures I was looking at weren't actually in Cheshire after all, but slipped across the border into Staffordshire when nobody was looking. Rather than waste all the information that I've been writing about, I discovered that Nick Redfern had been writing a book on Staffordshire. After one cheeky email later, I managed to get my material stuffed into the book. So I'll be talking about mainly the things that I've been writing about in the book, and leaving the stuff that Nick wrote for you all to read about later. So to start with, I'll be looking at black dogs and the sightings of them. The first reported sighting of a black dog in Staffordshire, or rather phantom dogs in Staffordshire, were the sounds of aerial hounds flying across the sky in 1668. At the time, a witness described them as being the most melodious creatures and sounds ever to be heard. 200 years later, when another researcher was reading about them, he attributed them to the Gabriel hounds, phantom dogs that race across the sky, making weird and wonderful noises. What these noises could be have been long open to interpretation. Some people state they're just nothing more than the sound of high-flying geese echoing off the ground. Other people have said that they're the sound of angels floating across the heavens, making a racket as they go. Some people have even gone as far to say that they are the souls of unbaptized children condemned to wander the higher atmosphere. Somehow I can't see a cluster of unbaptized children screaming away, sounding anything like a pleasant sound. We next move along to a place called, I think it's the Hardcastle Tunnel. And basically, the Hardcastle Tunnel is in Kidsgrove, and it's on the, I think it's the Mersey and Trent Canal. And in around 1830s, there was a lady who was basically travelling down to London on the canal. She'd left Liverpool earlier that week and was travelling down on a barge. Her choice of barge wasn't the best, as it turned out the crew were all complete drunkards. As the journey got further and further down the canal, she started to discover that they weren't particularly nice people. On a number of occasions, she tried to escape from the barge. On one occasion, getting off the barge and following the gatekeeper on one of the locks, only for the gatekeeper to be convinced by the people on the barge that she was actually just a disgruntled wife of one of the crew. So he packed her back on the barge and sent her back on her merry way. wasn't the best of decisions, because later that day, the rest of the crew murdered her, threw her body into the water, and thought no more of it. Until the next day, she washed up in the lock gates. From this murder that took place near the tunnel, it started the story of some kind of phantom creature that was to be haunting it. And they likened this to a boggart, some kind of mysterious creature that, depending on how you treated it, depended how it treated you. Traditionally, a boggart would be some kind of hobgoblin that came along and helped. For example, if you came across to a farmer who was toiling in his fields, it would quite happily toil in his fields doing whatever pointless task he happened to give it. But if you managed to upset the boggart, it turned into some kind of nasty, malicious creature that would do its best to try and cause chaos, tripping people up in houses, breaking things, making strange noises, all kinds of things to unsettle people. Now, what happens is that there was supposedly a boggart in the area of Kidsgrove, near where the tunnel is, and it would haunt the surrounding mines, and you could hear the sound of it. Again, it was more a kind of noise from the sky, or maybe the sound of things being smashed, and it would start to appear outside the houses of certain miners. And when the miners heard this noise, they took it to mean there was going to be some kind of accident in one of the pits. Considering the standards of safety in pits in Victorian England, it was hardly surprising you thought there was going to be an accident to follow. What had happened after the murder of this woman, that an author by the name of L.T. Mead in 1879 wrote a book called The Water Gypsies, of the Adventures of Tag, Bag and Bobtail, which told the accounts of barge folk sailing up and down the Trent and Mersey Canal. One of these stories that he put into it was of the Kidsgrove boggart, but he'd now merged it into the story of the murdered woman. So whereas before the boggart was some kind of unobservable force around the area, it was now being described as a headless woman. Despite the fact that until he wrote about it being a headless woman, nobody had ever seen it. As late as the 1950s, people were now starting to see a headless woman. Based on no more of a tradition of a children's book. But it wasn't just the boggart that was haunting the area. A local historian, Norman Roach, in the 1950s started to record tales of phantom dog sightings in the area of Kidsgrove. And he started by basically interviewing various people who'd either heard of some of the stories or seen them firsthand. And he started to think there was some kind of connection between dog sightings and pit disasters. And he would look into them and basically see if he could match the sighting with some disaster. Now, this is the most generic looking Victorian pit I could find from Staffordshire. It's actually the Dig Lake Colliery, and there was a couple of disasters there that supposedly happened after the sighting of the dog. Now when we looked at the number of sightings that had taken place, Roach had worked out that between 1860 and 1900 they seemed to match in with the different disasters. In 1866, a dog was seen running across the hill shortly before the top of the hill mine disaster, where 91 lives were lost because of a gas explosion. His next sighting was in 1873, when again the dog was sighted at the top crossroads prior to another gas explosion at the top of the hill pit. This time it killed 18 miners. It was a few more years before it turned up again in 1874. This time there was another gas explosion, but this time at the Bignall Hill mine. The next year, the black dog was sighted again. This time at the Bunkers Hill mine, where 43 people were killed in an accident caused by blasting. But so far, we can see that these accidents are not particularly unusual for mining. Certainly gas explosions in a time where safety lamps weren't invented was quite common. The explosion at the Bunkers Hill mine was when somebody set light to the blasting charges while inspecting them. There was another bigger disaster in 1895 at the Dig Lake colliery, and this time a miner on his way to the mine was accompanied by a large black fearsome hound that vanished before his eyes. And it was said that shortly after, the disaster occurred in which 77 miners drowned. And for the Tasteless Memorial, it's got the list of all 77 of the miners. Now, while it looks like they were certainly matching up sightings of the dog with with disasters, it wasn't always the case. And it could just be based on nothing more than the fact that when Roach was recording it, he just wanted to give this as his preferred theory, but it was tied in. There were further sightings. There was the manager of the Harecastle colliery encountered the phantom dog in 1886. He and a companion heard the sound of a large dog behind them and moved aside to let it pass, only on turning round to not notice anything there, but definitely felt the presence of a dog. Now you'd think if he was the mine manager that he certainly had a connection with the mine, and that any sighting or encounter with a phantom dog would have resulted in some kind of disaster. As it was, there was nothing that followed it. It could be, therefore, there was plenty of other sightings or reports of the phantom dog, or phantom dogs, that were never reported because it didn't tie into anything. If someone happened to be walking across one of the hills and heard the sound of a strange animal, they may go home and tell the loved ones about it later that evening, but in 2 days' time, it would just be old news. If they had an encounter with a dog and a coal mine exploded within a week, they could then say, I saw the dog and the explosion took place. As with many mining areas, eventually the coal mines started to die out, and today you won't find any in the area. And with the lack of mines, the number of dog sightings seems to die off as well. There were certainly sightings during the Second World War, when some travellers basically encountered the dog while walking between Kidsgrove and the surrounding area. And again, they would say that it was a large and mysterious hound that appeared as if out of nowhere. There was something unnerving about it that certainly caused a sense of terror or panic about it, and that once they encountered it, they were certainly shaken up. However, the dog didn't do anything that was aggressive towards them. It would more cross the path, disappear into a hedge. When we looked to see where the dog had gone, there was no trace of it whatsoever. And around the area of Kidsgrove, there was obviously a few sightings, and just a bit further along is the town of Moco, which, depending on which map I look at, is either in Cheshire or in Staffordshire. But in 1951, a policeman on his beat was cycling along and happened to see a huge dog. He describes it as having coal-black skin and large red eyes. Looking at the dog, he thought it looked very distressed and certainly was in need of assistance. He went across the dog, only for it to rush into the churchyard and to vanish before his very eyes. There was other sightings of dogs to be seen. A gentleman travelling from Harrishead to Kidsgrove on a frosty night said said that it was accompanied by a large dog that frightened him to death. However, while this dog accompanied him and again scared the life out of him, it left without causing any trouble and disappeared. In 1946, a nurse travelling through the area saw what she described as a large dog the size of a Great Dane, light in colour, that darted across the road in front of her before vanishing in front of her eyes again. Tying back to the early stories of boggart and disasters, when she told her husband about this sighting, he said that she'd seen the Kidsgrove boggart. The next night, there was a fire at one of the properties that the nurse may have been due to visit. Now, moving us away from phantom dogs, we're looking at one of the most fearsome underwater creatures you will find lurking in the British countryside, Jenny Greenteeth. Jenny Greenteeth is a strange and horrible creature that lurks under all kinds of weed. And basically, this kind of evil creature appears as a woman, sometimes with green skin, sometimes with green scraggly hair, pale green limbs, sharp teeth, long green fingernails, not the best looking of people, and she's said to hide under areas of still water. Now, certainly the tales of Jenny Greenteeth spread over the border into Cheshire, and the story is basically along the lines of that if you go too close to the water's edge and start messing with it, then she'll leap out and grab you and drag you to your doom, and nothing will be left to show where you've been. You'll just disappear below the green weed. Now, without really being able to think that this creature's real, the only way you could really see about testing the theory if it worked would be to stake out a pond, send a small child near the edge and see what happens. Well, some people might be prepared to do that, there's lots of people who would certainly stop you. But if you do happen to ever see anyone dragged into the water, definitely report it. Now, our next area we're looking at is Cannock Chase. Now, Cannock Chase is a large wooded area, and like many large wooded areas in the country, it has quite a few stories involved with it. Strange creatures that have been sighted, strange UFO-like sightings, all kinds of weird and wonderful things. Now, in 2007, there started to be reports of werewolves being sighted within Cannock Chase. Now, in the UK, the number of werewolf sightings are quite small. Say in the last 25 years, there's generally only been around 20 sightings, of which 19 of them appear to have just been in Cannock Chase. So whatever somebody was seeing was certainly odd within that area. However, there's no reason to say that it really was a werewolf. There's lots of other things it could have been seen. So it's something that Nick Redfern certainly looked at in more detail, but there has been an account of something strange, or certainly somebody thinking they were a werewolf being reported in Staffordshire. Back in 1975, an apprentice joiner called Andrew Prinnoff was found dead at Crossroads one morning by a passing postman. And during the inquest, they basically discovered some details about him. That a few weeks before, he'd been taking part in a séance with 5 of his friends. After some drinking, they decided to contact some random spirits. During which time, Andrew became very distressed, started to look panicked, started to be convinced he'd become possessed by something. He started to cause quite a scene that seemed to certainly unnerve his companions and his friends. one of his friends taken rather drastic action of knocking him out. Whether that happens at most seances is hard to say, but certainly put an end to this one. However, in the next few days, his conviction that he'd become possessed started to grow, and he now started to think that he was turning into a werewolf. And on one of these occasions, he phoned his friends and basically said that he'd looked in the mirror and started to notice that both his face and hands had started to change, and that this started to take on the appearance of a wolf, and that he couldn't let this happen. So taking the rather drastic action of going out at night with a knife and supposedly committing suicide on the crossroads. Whether this really was the case of somebody who thought they were turning into a werewolf, or just someone who was deluded, we'll never know. Now, leaving werewolves behind, we've also got reports of vampires, or at least vampire activity. And it was in 1972 that there was basically a strange death that was investigated that suggested that at least somebody thought there was a vampire. And it took place at this rather charming house, number 3, the Villas. Now, it was a November night when PC John Pye was called to this house to basically see about a resident who hadn't been seen. Well, today it looks a nice, fine Victorian mansion house. And back in the 1970s, it was a boarding house subdivided into lots of plots. This particular house was catering for mainly Eastern European, Polish workers in the pottery industry. And the owner of the house, Mrs. Rodzgaski, possibly, known locally as Mrs. Rod, for ease of pronunciation, had called the police after she'd been unable to contact one of her residents who'd not come out of his room for a couple of days. A Demetrius Mikikaru, who was either a 68-year-old Pole or a 68-year-old Ukrainian. No one's too sure of his exact nationality. He appeared in Staffordshire following the Second World War in around 1948. And like many people after the Second World War from Eastern Europe, he was escaping communist occupation. Whether that was because he was a Pole who basically discovered that his country disappeared, or whether he was a Ukrainian who'd fought for the wrong side and discovered that it wasn't a good idea going back to Ukraine. Now, when PC Pye goes to the house, he just expects it to be nothing more than a report of a death, basically. After all, the man was in his late 60s, and experience had told him that if you call to a house where somebody in the late 60s had not appeared, chances were they were dead. Now, when he gets to the house, he notes that actually it's quite an unpleasant place. Not necessarily because it's haunted or anything, it's just not a very nice building. It's run down, it's seen better days. He goes along up the stairs and along the corridor to where Mr. Mikikaru's room is, and notices it's one of the darkest corridors that he's ever been down. It's damp, it's dark. He describes it as having one of the lowest wattage light bulbs known, which before energy-saving light bulbs was quite a rare thing. When he gets to his room, he notices quite an unpleasant smell. So he's definitely expecting the worst. The door's locked, but it's not going to stand in his way, so basically puts his shoulder against it and forces the door open. Once the door's open, absolute stink pours out the room. He fumbles for the light switch to try and get the room lit up. When he switches it on, nothing happens. Turns out the light bulb's been taken out. It appears that the resident in the room had a fear of electricity and had basically taken out all the bulbs that were ever put in there, to the point where the landlady had decided not to bother replacing any of the bulbs. Having to use a torch, PC Ply basically illuminates the room and finds Mr. Mikikaru on his bed under a blanket in a room that measured just 6 foot by 8. It certainly was not one of the best rooms you could be living in. In this room there was a bed which was lay out on with a blanket covering his face. Pulling back the blanket, he noticed that he dislodged a number of bags that fell onto the floor. And he was faced with the mortal remains of Mr. Mikikaru, who basically appeared to have choked to death. His eyes were staring out, there was the remains of foam around his lips, and his hands were clenched high at the side of his head. But he was also surrounded by strange slivers of some kind of object. Bags that seemed to be filled with some kind of substance. On closer inspection, they turned out to be garlic and bags of salt. As he looked further around the room, he noticed more bags of salt lying about. Deciding that, well, it was certainly an unfortunate death, there was nothing too surprising about it, he decided to let some air in, so he opens the window. And outside the window, he finds there's basically a small ledge, and on this ledge is an upturned bowl. Curiosity getting the better of him, he lifts this bowl up to uncover a plate. And on this plate is human excrement with cloves of garlic stuck in it. This wasn't garlic that had been digested, this was garlic that had been deliberately put into the remains. Now, he finds this quite bizarre, as you would. Reports it high up the chain, and basically they say, well, look into it and find out what you can. So in the days before Wikipedia, he goes down to the library and gets out a book on vampires. He starts to read through it and discovers some interesting facts. That basically, the cloves of garlic, the vampires don't like garlic. The bags of salt was that if a vampire came into your room and found a bag of salt, it was obliged to count the salt before moving on to you. So basically, by leaving the salt around, with a big enough pile of salt, the vampire would come in and slowly start counting it, giving you time to leave by the window, leave by the door, wander off, book other appointments, do whatever you like. If you left enough salt behind, it wasn't going to bother you. The human excrement on the window ledge was because vampires liked eating human excrement. Certainly not something you find in most teen films these days, where vampires seem to have nice pearly white teeth. By putting the garlic in the excrement, it was hoped that the vampire would start eating on it, only to choke on the garlic without realising what it was eating. Once he found out all this information, he was convinced that basically the gentleman had been certainly afraid of vampires and may have had a real fear of them. But when the pathologist looked at the body, he said that the gentleman had choked on a pickled onion. Thinking this was a bit odd, he asked him if he could have a look again, because it could be garlic. And it did turn out to be a bulb of garlic, but basically it appeared he'd been keeping it in his mouth at night to make sure that if the vampire got past the excrement, got past the salt, and got past the other garlic and decided to jump down his throat, would find it as the last barrier to stop him reviving. Unfortunately, during his sleep, he'd managed to choke on it. Now, while it might not mean that there was a real vampire running around the place, we could actually use it as the evidence of the remains of vampire activity. That basically, if we see a dismembered sheep carcass up a tree, do we start to think of it that there's been a big camp in the area? If we look at a dead Polish or Ukrainian pottery worker surrounded by the paraphernalia of vampire stopping items, do we then think that he basically really had a justifiable fear? Well, certainly there have been sightings of other vampiric creatures, and in 1972 there was certainly something reported in Cheshire of a vampire that attacked two girls. However, that's for a different book. The next thing we'll be looking at is ghostly rabbits, possibly one of the most dangerous and vengeful animals ever to have crawled out of a hutch. And the events take place in, I think it was early 19th century. It takes place just in the Stoke area, in the area of Troyer. And basically, Charles Shaw, a 16-year-old, is travelling back from one of her potteries with his friend John Aldcroft, who had been paid for some work he'd done. This princely sum of 1 shilling and 6 pence. And on the journey home, they had decided to play some games. Well, according to Charles Shaw anyway, they decided to play a game by the riverbank. He reckoned that during the game, John Aldcroft had basically fell into the water and drowned. Unfortunately, other witnesses reporting attacking John Aldcroft and basically stealing his money. This was certainly enough for him to be charged with the murder. And once he'd been charged with the murder, there started to be sightings of a ghostly animal, a ghostly rabbit turning up on the pathway where the murder had taken place. And this pathway basically was between Troyer and Cobridge, and it was a wooded walkway, a wooded lane. And around midnight, a ghostly white rabbit would suddenly appear from one side of the trackway and hop across to the other side. Now, once it started hopping across, people started thinking, oh, that's nice little fluffy rabbit. But once it appeared at the opposite side of the pathway, you could start to hear the screams and shouts of a young child in anguish. This was generally attributed to being the last desperate attempts of John Aldcroft getting away from his murderer. Obviously, this kind of story attracted all kinds of attention, and one person basically decided to catch the rabbit. So he heads out one night and sets himself up on the pathway, waiting for midnight to arrive. As he's there, he starts getting colder. Probably thinks it's a daft idea. But hey, it's only a ghostly rabbit, what danger can he do? Eventually, midnight appears, and as if by magic, the rabbit appears as well, and starts hopping along the path. Our intrepid ghost catcher jumps at the rabbit. He's convinced that he gets his hands on it, but instead of meeting the body of a firm rabbit, he flies straight through it, landing badly and fracturing his shoulder, only for the rabbit to hop on his merry way. Obviously, a ghostly rabbit dancing around is all you need to convict you of a murder. It's bad enough being caught with a body, but once a demon rabbit starts appearing, that's it, nothing for you. And this was the case with Charles Shaw. He's basically charged with the murder and he's found guilty. He's sentenced to hang. And you think that's where the story ends. However, despite the fact that in the past some criminal justice was a bit on the bloody side, but decided because of his age he was just going to be transported instead and heads off to Tasmania. At the end of his sentence, it would appear that he settles down in Tasmania and leaves the rest of his life quite happily. However, he just seems to disappear from records once he's released. At the same time, the ghostly rabbit seems to have disappeared as well. Whether this is because people don't spend the nights now lurking on pathways waiting for rabbits to appear, or simply, now that the murderer had gone, had the rabbit set off after him. How long would it take a ghostly rabbit to travel from Stoke all the way to Tasmania? Could it take 20 or 30 years? Did the rabbit set off after him, waiting to catch him, unawares one night somewhere in the Tasmanian outback? But it's not the only ghostly rabbit to be found in the area. there was a rabbit spotted, again near Kids Grove, a place called Clough Hall. And this rabbit, basically, again, was a white rabbit that danced around. And when this rabbit was spotted, it was generally thought to signify that there was a death coming. However, some of the reports about this rabbit, these sightings, do make you wonder just how close the deaths were related to the sighting of a rabbit. Certainly, on one occasion, a witness sees the rabbit, and a few days later, a family member dies. On another occasion, the witness sees the rabbit, and a few days, or it says, maybe a month later, some friend of a friend dies. Well, some friend of a friend who knows somebody who's died. As phantom demon creatures that cause death go, that's pretty poor. You'd expect a sighting to definitely result in the death of a number of people, not just some random sighting. There is one other ghostly rabbit I know about that isn't actually from Staffordshire, but is rather from Lancashire. And that's the phantom rabbit of Crank. And basically, the phantom rabbit of Crank was a white rabbit that was the pet of a young woman called Jenny, who lived with her grandmother. And as was the way at the time, a couple of people started to think the grandmother was a witch and decided to beat a confession out of her. The two men were Pullen and Piers. And basically, Pullen and Piers decided to do their civic duty and go and torture this little old lady. Once they decide to set about her, Jenny grabs a rabbit and runs away, trying to escape. But once they've managed to kill the old lady, they run after her and eventually catch her. And unfortunately, managed to kill Jenny and the rabbit, beating it against the ground until it was dead. Thinking we might have got away with it, they were no doubt shocked to find the white rabbit starting to hunt them and chase them down. With Pullen, it basically followed him around, and everywhere he went he found this white rabbit dogging his every step, driving him to distraction to a point where he then eventually goes to Billinge Quarry and jumps off it, committing suicide. Where his compatriot wasn't just being followed by the rabbit, he was last seen being chased by the rabbit across the fields and died of exhaustion. So if you are being followed by a ghostly rabbit, you're probably best giving it a carrot and hoping it goes away. So, that's basically all I've got to say about Staffordshire at the moment. Has anybody got any questions?
Okay, Steve Jones and Flash. And George, you haven't got the microphone. Hang on. Okay, take it up to Steve.
Yeah, I was wondering, Glen, Staffordshire is one of my favourite counties, and I've actually seen the Phantom Dog and Tablet Castle. But I wondered if you address, obviously I've read the book, the Abercrombie Horn Dance, where the horn is coming from. Because there's a bit of a mystery as to whether the horns are real reindeer horns that come reindeer in this country, or whether they were brought in from abroad.
Sorry, I couldn't really hear.
Right, sorry. What I was saying, Glen, the Abercrombie Horn Dance, the horns used in the horn dance, I wondered if you'd actually address where they came from. Because for years it was thought that the horns came from abroad and were brought back by one of the lords of the manor. But they were carbon dated when the bit dropped off one of them, and it was dated back to the 10th century when reindeer was still in this country. So there was a possibility that it may actually be from British reindeer, which is one of the unusual. I just wondered if you addressed that.
It's not, as far as I know, part of what we looked at. Certainly I didn't look at it, and from what I recall, Nick hasn't looked at that aspect of it. But certainly it's very interesting, and something I'd like to look at in future.
Any other questions? Yes, we have two at the front. First of all, let's have Henry.
Have you ever seen one of the ghosts?
I don't personally think I have ever ghost. I suspect that I may have once seen a mysterious phantom dog in a castle in Scotland. The castle was Kilchurn Castle, and to get to it is a pathway that's roughly about half a mile long. And while going round this castle, I was approached by a large dog. It looked quite odd when it appeared, and there was no sign of where it had come from. It certainly been a struggle to get there. It would have been quite good had it not been for the fact it was called off by a strange old bloke in the corner who called it Donald. I'd always thought that if he was going to be approached by a hellhound, he'd have some better name than that. So I suspect it was just some bloke who was possibly just tossing in the castle with his dog. However, to this day, I'd love to know if it really was some kind of mystery creature, but otherwise I've managed to avoid all kinds of strange, scary, unnerving or otherwise weird creatures. I'll leave that for other people to encounter.
Next question.
Any recent sightings of the King of the Cats?
Again, I've basically tried to steer away of all sightings of cats.
This is the silly fairy tale, but it's supposed to first have been recorded and it was described as the wilderness of Cank, i.e. Cannock Chase. And the story is supposed to have come from Ireland, where there's a tradition of a colossal cat called the Irusam who runs away with a poet clutched in his jaws. But,
with the writing of the book, I know that Nick basically concentrated on the cat parts of it.
He's the cat man.
Whereas I tried to stick to the more basic bits he'd not wrote about, bits he'd already been looking at, so the phantom dog aspects, the more phantom creatures rather than the flesh and blood or the cat related. Certainly there was a lot of material about cats, and rather than start looking into cats and deciding which bits you'd already done, because at the time I was writing one part unaware that Nick had been writing the other part. So when I found out he'd been writing about it, I just thought, well, these bits, checked with him which bits he had wrote, and then didn't bother looking into some of the other parts rather than duplicate what was going on.
I think we've got time. Any more questions? Any more? Let's have the microphone then, Jojo, my dear. And I think Jojo has been absolutely brilliant rushing around all weekend for us. I'm very, very proud of her. She's done fantastic. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Glen was somebody I'd never heard of until we started doing the daily CFZ blog about 4 years ago. And I got this totally out of the blue, this series of the blog posts coming in, and they were on really interesting things I'd never thought of. A lot of them about things in Scotland or in the Arctic. And then there were things about the Great Ork, and things about stellar sea cows, things I personally found really interesting. And then I made an announcement. I said we were going to start this series, the Mystery Animals of the Mystery Animals of the British Isles. And was anybody interested in writing a chapter, or writing a volume or so? And all the usual suspects contacted me. But then I got this letter from Glen. Was anybody going to be doing the Western Isles? I said, no. Nobody approached me about the Western Isles. Yes, go ahead and do it. I've never read any of his writing that's more than 3 paragraphs, but I'm sure he can do it. And he delivered this massively entertaining and very in-depth book about the mystery animals of the Western Isles. And a year or so later it was, what about fighting one on the Northern Isles? I said, yeah, go for it. And then he did a book for us on sea serpent carcasses. Again, something completely groundbreaking. And now he's written with Nick Redfern this book, Mystery Animals of Staffordshire. Well, we've got all 4 of his books here. Today is the proper launch of Mystery Animals of Staffordshire, and Glen will, of course, sign it for anybody who wants to. All the books of his are £12.50 in the shops. Today they are going for £10 each, and Glen will sign them. And to make things even more of a sweetener, anybody who wants to buy 3 of his books now 3 for the price of 2, because I think it's important more important than us making money out of this is what Glen writes gets to a larger audience, because his writing is absolutely fabulous. He's someone I'm very fond of, and I'm really chuffed to have him here with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Glen Vaudrey. Now, come on, form an orderly queue and come and buy some books. If you don't come and buy some books, I will make loud noises out of you. And we have half of Staffordshire, half of the population of Staffordshire here in the room.